The evening sky over the Mariana Islands burned orange, streaked with the last traces of daylight. On Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, the runways stretched like endless ribbons of steel and concrete, silent for now but brimming with intent. It was March 9, 1945. In the humid twilight, the Pacific was calm, the kind of stillness that precedes something vast and irreversible. Across the American airfields, crews moved with rehearsed precision. Floodlights cast long shadows across the gleaming metal fuselages of 325 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers. The men checking engines, tightening bolts, and loading ordnance had done this 100 times before. Tonight, however, was not like the other missions. The operation that waited just beyond dusk would become the single most destructive air raid in human history. Major General Curtis LeMay, recently placed in command of the 21st Bomber Command, watched from the control tower at Guam's North Field. Behind the square-framed glasses and clipped tone was a man not prone to hesitation. In January, he had inherited a faltering bombing campaign, one that had achieved little more than scattered damage. Now, on this night, he intended to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. LeMay's plan was brutal in its simplicity. Gone were the high-altitude precision raids that scattered bombs harmlessly into Tokyo Bay. Tonight, the bombers would fly low, 5,000 to 7,000 feet, and unleash an ocean of fire. Their payloads were not the usual heavy explosives but incendiary clusters, each filled with M69 napalm bomblets, engineered to ignite Japan's wooden cities like kindling. As twilight deepened, the bombers stood ready in neat lines, their silver skins reflecting the floodlights. Inside the bomb bays, 40 cluster bombs per plane waited to be armed, together containing more than 424,000 individual incendiaries. In the silence before engines roared, some aircrews stared at their aircraft with quiet disbelief. Others forced a hard grin, hiding nerves behind practiced bravado. The mission brief was clear, and the numbers cold. The target was the Shitamachi district of Tokyo, home to 750,000 civilians living in wooden homes packed into narrow streets. Flight crews climbed aboard, the metallic click of boots against gangways echoing through the night. Inside the pressurized cabins, the smell of oil, sweat, and steel hung heavy. The gunners' stations were stripped down to reduce weight, only the tail guns remained. Every pound saved meant more incendiaries carried, a calculated trade, fewer defenses for overwhelming firepower. At 17:35, the first engine turned over with a growling roar. One after another, rows of Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines came alive, 8,000 pistons pumping, the night trembling with their thunder. The control tower windows shivered with each ignition. Mechanics gave thumbs up. Navigation lights flickered to life along the wings. The first B-29 rolled down the runway, its wheels clattering on concrete, then lifting free into the darkening sky. Behind it, another followed, and another. No tight formation this time. Each bomber would fly individually, threading a line across the Pacific, using radio navigation to converge over Tokyo in waves through the night. As the bombers disappeared into the darkness, a strange quiet settled on the airfields. The ground crews, now idle, lit cigarettes and stared at the horizon. They had sent their machines toward a target most of them would never see. Above the ocean, the flight path stretched like an invisible bridge. For the men inside the B-29s, the journey would last 14 hours, long, monotonous, and then deadly. The Pacific night offered only the hum of engines and the occasional creak of metal as temperature changed at altitude. They flew without escorts, stripped of armor, trusting that speed and darkness would be their defense. Each plane carried a crew of 11. Pilots focused on instruments glowing faintly in the dark. Navigators traced radio beams from stations on the islands. Radio operators listened to the chatter of dozens of bombers spread across hundreds of miles, all heading toward the same city. Many had flown over Tokyo before, at 30,000 feet, dropping bombs that drifted off target in fierce jet stream winds. But tonight, they would descend low, into the dangerous space between radar and cloud. Far away in Tokyo, the night was uneventful. Air raid sirens remained silent. Civilian families cooked dinner, small workshops continued their shift work, and no one yet knew what was coming. The Shitamachi district, where wooden homes crowded together in a dense lattice, had endured bombing raids before. None had done more than leave scattered craters. Many residents had grown complacent, believing Tokyo's scale and defenses would keep them safe. Back in the Marianas, as the last wave of bombers took off, LeMay studied the weather reports. Conditions were ideal. Clear skies and, most importantly, strong winds forecast over Tokyo, winds that would fan the flames into a storm of fire. His plan depended on it. The bombing would be concentrated, fast, and devastating. Separate ignition points would merge into a single firestorm, consuming everything in its path. LeMay knew exactly what that meant. So did the planners who had built replica Japanese neighborhoods in Utah to test these very weapons. Napalm had proven horrifyingly efficient, and now the experiment would be repeated in the heart of a living city. In the quiet of the command center, a staff officer whispered to another, almost involuntarily, "If this works, Tokyo will burn." No one responded. They all understood. Thousands of feet above the ocean, crew members stared through small windows into darkness. Some thought of home. Some thought of what they were about to unleash. A few, in letters they would write after the war, admitted they had an uneasy feeling even before the bombing began, not fear of being shot down, but of what they were part of. As the bombers neared Japan, Mount Fuji's white peak appeared faintly in the distance, a silent beacon in the moonlight. It was the first landmark, the sign that the Pacific crossing was nearly done. They tightened their harnesses, checked the bomb bays, adjusted oxygen masks. In Tokyo, midnight approached. Most citizens still slept, unaware that hundreds of aircraft were converging on them. The defenders, limited in number and equipment, had no early warning radar strong enough to detect what was on its way. The first B-29s approached the coast at low altitude, their engines muffled by distance and darkness. On the ground, no alarms sounded yet. The night was still deceptively peaceful. Curtis LeMay's calculated gamble was already in motion. The calm before the inferno would last only a few more minutes. Long before the first bomber rose into the Pacific night, the arsenal that would ignite Tokyo had been forged in the vast foundries and assembly lines of the United States. The B-29 superfortress was more than a machine. It was a declaration of industrial supremacy, conceived in boardrooms and born on factory floors that never slept. In 1940, when war still raged far from America's shores, engineers began designing an aircraft that could do what no bomber had done before: fly higher, farther, and faster than any enemy defense could reach. Boeing's blueprints for the B-29 required an unprecedented 1.4 million engineering man-hours. It was a leap into modern warfare, a pressurized, heavily armed giant with an operational range that spanned oceans. By the time the Pacific campaign reached its peak, the program had consumed more than $3 billion, a staggering sum that even surpassed the cost of the Manhattan Project. And unlike the atomic bomb, the B-29 was not a secret weapon hidden in the desert. It was a visible, roaring testament to American capacity to build, scale, and overwhelm. Production stretched across the nation like a coordinated symphony of metal and manpower. Boeing's plants in Seattle, Renton, and Wichita, Martin in Omaha, and Bell in Marietta, Georgia, all worked around the clock. Conveyor belts clanked under the weight of aluminum frames. Women and men in coveralls riveted, welded, and wired. Every day, the Wichita factory alone delivered more than 4 new superfortresses, a rhythm of production that no Axis power could match. Each aircraft was an engineering marvel: a 141-foot wingspan, a 99-foot fuselage, 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines that pushed out 2,200 horsepower each, propelling the plane to speeds over 350 miles per hour. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate comfortably at altitudes where most Japanese aircraft could barely reach. Remote-controlled gun turrets represented the cutting edge of aviation technology, a level of complexity so advanced that the bomber required years of design and field testing to perfect. But technology alone wasn't what made the B-29 so formidable. It was the scale. By March 1945, over 2,000 aircraft had already been delivered, with more coming off the line every week. America was not merely producing planes, it was producing the means to sustain a strategic air war across continents. That scale was part of the strategy. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, understood that controlling the air meant controlling the pace of war. The 20th Air Force, operating directly under his command, became the vehicle for that vision. When the Mariana Islands were captured in mid-1944, engineers and Seabees carved massive airfields out of coral and jungle. Runways longer than any built before in the Pacific stretched out toward the horizon, platforms designed specifically for the B-29's heavy frames and massive payloads. These airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian would become launch pads for fire. Meanwhile in Washington, analysts calculated how much damage those bombers could inflict not in single raids, but in months of sustained firebombing. American industrial power wasn't about a single decisive blow, it was about attrition on a scale Japan could not survive. Inside those factories, the people building the bombers often understood what their work meant. On the assembly lines, messages were sometimes scribbled in chalk inside the fuselages: "Finish it fast, end the war." Many workers had brothers or sons in the Pacific. They weren't just building machines, they were sending a message across the ocean. The technology of destruction extended beyond the aircraft itself. The M69 incendiary bomblet, designed in collaboration between Standard Oil, Harvard University, and the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, represented a new kind of weapon. A small steel cylinder weighing 6 pounds, it contained napalm, a sticky, jellied gasoline that burned at over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. When released from their clusters, the bomblets deployed small streamers that stabilized their fall. On impact, a delayed fuse triggered a burst of flame that clung to wood, tatami mats, and bamboo, exactly the materials that made up most of Tokyo's neighborhoods. Water could not extinguish it. Entire buildings could be set ablaze in seconds. To test this weapon, American engineers didn't guess. They built replica Japanese neighborhoods in the Utah desert, exact copies of wooden row houses, narrow alleys, and workshops. Controlled burns proved that once ignited, fire would spread faster than any civil defense force could contain. What began as an experiment in fire propagation would soon become a citywide inferno. Back at the strategic level, the numbers were brutally simple. A fully loaded B-29 could carry 7 tons of incendiaries. Multiply that by 300 bombers, and the raid would rain down over 1,600 tons of fire in a single night. Add wind, add wood, add density. The result was predictable: a firestorm, a living, expanding force that consumed everything in its path. Japanese industry had no counterweight to this kind of projection. America could replace aircraft faster than Japan could shoot them down. A single B-29 might cost millions, but the U.S. war machine was producing them faster than the Imperial Japanese forces could destroy them. It wasn't just a technological advantage. It was a war of capacity versus scarcity, and capacity was winning. On the night of March 9, that advantage was about to be made manifest. The bombers lifting off from the Marianas carried not just fire, but the weight of a system designed to crush resistance through relentless efficiency. Far from the factories on those Pacific runways, the crews felt the machine's scale in their bones. They flew aircraft built by people they would never meet, carrying weapons designed by scientists who had never seen Tokyo. It was a chain: engineers, manufacturers, strategists, pilots, each playing their part in a carefully constructed war plan. To LeMay and his superiors, this wasn't improvisation. It was execution. Every gallon of fuel, every rivet, every bomblet had been planned, allocated, and delivered across thousands of miles of ocean. This was modern war in its purest, most industrial form, organized, methodical, and terrifyingly impersonal. What made the B-29 truly fearsome was not how loudly it roared, but how inevitably it arrived. In the dark skies between the Marianas and Tokyo, hundreds of these steel behemoths now moved silently toward their target. Their mere existence told a story. Japan was facing not just an army, but an entire nation's industry aimed at its heart. While the American bombers crossed the Pacific in quiet formation, Japan lay on the opposite side of the battlefield, vast in geography, proud in spirit, but stretched to its breaking point. By March 1945, Tokyo's defenses looked formidable on paper. Anti-aircraft units ringed the city, night fighter squadrons patrolled the skies, searchlights waited to pierce the darkness. But this was not the Japan of 1941. The nation that had once seized territory across Asia now faced an enemy with overwhelming material power. Its defenses were fragmented, under-equipped, and blind at night. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy ran their own air defense networks, but they operated without true coordination. Communications between services were slow, confused, and often contradictory. Radar coverage was limited. When alerts did come, they often arrived minutes too late, far too little time to intercept bombers flying fast and low. Tokyo's main night interceptor was the Nakajima J-1N Gecko, nicknamed Moonlight. It was never designed for night combat. It had begun life as a reconnaissance aircraft. To make it a night fighter, engineers had bolted on upward and downward firing cannons, a makeshift solution meant to attack bombers from unexpected angles. But improvisation could not replace capability. Only 479 Geckos had ever been built. Many were already lost. The rest were scattered across the home islands, spread too thin to defend Tokyo effectively. Another fighter, the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, the Dragon Slayer, boasted heavier guns, including a 37mm cannon in the nose. On paper, it could bring down a bomber with a single burst. In practice, there were barely 100 operational aircraft left, and fuel shortages kept many grounded. The cruel arithmetic of war had caught up with Japan. Against hundreds of B-29s, it could muster perhaps 200 operational night fighters across the entire archipelago. Even if every pilot had launched that night, which they did not, the numbers were nowhere close. And numbers weren't the only problem. Japanese pilots were brave, but few were trained for night operations. With gasoline rationed and training flights reduced to a trickle, younger flyers entered combat with only minimal experience in darkness. Many relied on nothing more than visual spotting to find enemy aircraft. Against bombers coming in low and individually, scattered over miles of night sky, interception became almost impossible. Ground defenses offered little reassurance. Tokyo's anti-aircraft guns numbered under 500 heavy pieces. The mainstay of the defense, the Type 99 88mm gun, had limited altitude range. Lighter 20mm cannons could hit targets at closer range, but were practically useless once the bombers were overhead, dropping incendiaries from altitudes still beyond their reach. Worse still, Japan lacked fire control radar for its guns. Crews depended on optical rangefinders and sound locators, instruments that worked, barely in daylight or clear weather. But at night, in the noise and confusion of incoming bombers, these tools were nearly worthless. On the ground, officers knew the truth. Tokyo was vulnerable. Major General Curtis LeMay understood that vulnerability better than most. In January, when he took command of the 21st Bomber Command, the B-29 campaign had been bogged down by high-altitude precision raids. Flying at 30,000 feet, bombers scattered their payloads in the jet stream winds that tore across the Pacific at over 200 miles per hour. Bombs meant for Tokyo often landed miles away. Engine failures were common too. Pushing those massive right engines to altitude strained their magnesium alloy components until they overheated. Crew fatigue grew. Mission accuracy fell. Tokyo was being hit, but not hard enough to matter. LeMay was not a man who accepted half measures. Cold, methodical, and fiercely pragmatic, he studied the data, spoke to pilots, and then made a radical decision that would change the air war over Japan. He would bring the bombers down low. Flying at 5,000 to 9,000 feet, they would avoid the jet stream entirely. It would make their bomb runs deadlier, their aim surer, their flight shorter. But there was a price. They would be within range of enemy guns, exposed, vulnerable if intercepted. LeMay calculated that the risk was acceptable, not because the bombers had suddenly become invincible, but because Japan lacked the means to stop them. He then stripped the planes of all but their tail guns. Every defensive turret removed meant more incendiaries loaded. Each bomber would carry double its normal payload. They would not fly in tight combat boxes like over Europe. They would stream in individually over the city, wave after wave, so that Japanese defenses could never concentrate fire in one place. Finally, the attack would happen at night, when Tokyo's defenders were least prepared. Night raids would minimize the chance of fighter interception and disrupt the city's already thin command structure. March 9 was chosen not just for operational convenience but because of the weather. Forecasters predicted clear skies and strong surface winds, the perfect conditions to turn hundreds of small fires into one roaring, self-sustaining firestorm. The target zone was already mapped in detail: Shitamachi, Tokyo's oldest and most densely populated district. Intelligence reports showed not only homes, but small workshops producing war-critical components hidden in residential blocks. This made it, officially, a military target, but everyone understood what that really meant. The fire would not stop at the edge of any factory. In briefing rooms across Guam and Tinian, LeMay's officers laid out the plan to crews. The language was technical, clipped, detached, payload weights, navigation corridors, wind vectors. But beneath the numbers was an undeniable truth: they were about to burn down a city. Some airmen felt a chill as they heard it. Others, hardened by years of war, nodded grimly. A few were relieved. A low-altitude night run, however dangerous, meant shorter missions and better accuracy. Many believed this could hasten the end of the war. Back in Tokyo, however, no one was preparing. The Japanese high command still expected high-altitude raids. They believed their scattered defenses would give some warning. They were wrong. As the clock moved toward midnight, the city's defenses waited in darkness, watching the skies, unaware that the bombers were already overhead, lower, faster, and deadlier than ever before. The first sign that something extraordinary was about to happen came not from the ground, but from the night sky above the Pacific. At 17:35 hours, the initial bomber lifted off from Guam's North Field, slicing through the twilight air. By the time the last aircraft departed, the darkness was absolute, and the Pacific was alive with the sound of hundreds of engines moving in quiet formation. Unlike the daylight precision raids that had characterized earlier missions, this time the bombers flew alone, spread out across a vast corridor of night, each guided by radio beams and onboard navigation. Their formation wasn't a tight combat box but a rolling stream, timed to arrive over Tokyo in waves, not as a single mass. This was Curtis LeMay's design: overwhelm the defenders, not all at once, but relentlessly, hour after hour. For the men inside those aircraft, the journey felt endless. The Pacific offered no landmarks, only darkness and the low hum of engines. The navigators' glowing instruments and the faint red lights inside the fuselage gave everything a surreal, almost submarine quality. Men sat quietly in their stations, breathing through oxygen masks, their eyes flicking between gauges and the blackness outside. Every so often, a voice crackled through the radio, status updates, positional confirmations. They were not allowed to break silence with idle chatter. Discipline was ironclad. These were bombers built for long-range war, and now they were heading toward their most consequential mission yet. Hours later, Japan's coast emerged beneath them, black against black, a dark shoreline without a sound. Mount Fuji, snow-capped and ghostly in the moonlight, rose like a sentinel on the horizon. For airmen who had crossed the Pacific many times, this was the sign they were almost there. Tokyo slept. Midnight approached. The first aircraft in the Pathfinder group began its descent to the planned attack altitude of 5,000 feet. Their job was clear: drop M47 napalm bombs to mark the target zone, a huge X over the Shitamachi district. The crews had rehearsed this moment countless times. As the city came into view, Pathfinder pilots saw only darkness below, a sprawling metropolis without light. The blackout was nearly perfect. But the city's outline betrayed itself, a faint geometric shape, bisected by the Sumida River. At 12:08 a.m., the first Pathfinder released its payload. A second later, the night ignited. The napalm markers exploded into towers of fire, tracing a blazing X across northeastern Tokyo. The site was visible for miles. Behind them, the first wave of main bombers followed. In precision didn't matter now. The fire itself would guide them. In the neighborhoods below, air raid sirens began to wail at last. Too late. Civilians had heard sirens before, high-altitude raids that came and went without devastating consequence. Many hesitated, unsure if this one would be any different. Some remained in their homes. Others shuffled toward shallow shelters, little more than trenches covered with boards. Tokyo had only 18 concrete air raid shelters for more than 4 million people. The rest would be left exposed. Then the bombers arrived in earnest. Each B-29 carried 40 E-46 clusters, each packed with M-69 incendiaries. As they fell from the bomb bays, the clusters broke open, scattering steel cylinders that streamed downward like deadly seeds. At 2,000 feet, the bomblets armed themselves, fuses ticking toward ignition. Witnesses would later say it sounded like heavy rain striking the city. When they landed, the napalm burst outward, clinging to walls, rooftops, doors, tatami mats, anything combustible. Flames bloomed across the district in hundreds of places at once, then thousands. Within minutes, individual fires merged into a single, pulsing storm of heat. The wind, just as the forecasters had predicted, picked up fast. Gusts reached 45 miles per hour, fanning the flames down the narrow alleys of Shitamachi like air through a furnace. The fire wasn't spreading, it was running. Back in the air, bomber crews could see the glow of the fire from miles away, a roiling orange Red Sea consuming the streets below. The turbulence above the inferno was unlike anything they had felt before. Aircraft shuddered as they passed over rising columns of superheated air. Smoke rose into the flight path, visible even at operational altitude, and many crews reported having to fight to keep control of their planes. Below, the temperature soared past 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and soften steel. Wooden homes collapsed within minutes of ignition. Roof tiles shattered from the heat. The air itself burned. People tried to flee. Families grabbed what they could and ran toward the Sumida River, one of the few open spaces left in the district. But the fire was faster. The flames moved with a predatory intelligence, following wind channels, consuming oxygen, pulling fresh air into its core. Firefighters with hand pumps and buckets, Tokyo's primary defense, stood no chance. Many abandoned their posts as the heat grew unbearable. In the command center back on Guam, LeMay received the first field reports. From over 1,500 miles away, he could not see Tokyo, but he knew from the coded radio bursts what was happening. Target hit, fire spreading, wind strong. Exactly as planned. The second wave of bombers arrived, and then the third. Each added thousands more incendiaries to a city already engulfed. The glow was visible from 30 miles out to sea. By the time the last aircraft crossed the target, Shitamachi was no longer a district, it was a furnace. Even seasoned aircrew, hardened by years of bombing missions, were shaken by the sight. One pilot would later write in his journal, "It wasn't a fire on the ground, it was as if the city itself had become fire." Japanese defenses fired when they could. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky, but the bombers flew too low and too scattered to be targeted effectively. Anti-aircraft batteries erupted, but the explosion seemed almost meaningless, a handful of shells against a sky full of bombers. Fighter squadrons scrambled in confusion. Pilots struggled to find targets in the dense smoke and chaotic radio chatter. A few interceptors climbed into the night but were swallowed by darkness. Most would never even reach the bombers. By 2 a.m., the fire had grown so large it generated its own wind system, a true firestorm. A roaring updraft sucked oxygen from the streets, creating hurricane-like currents that tore doors from hinges and hurled burning debris through the air. People who tried to escape found themselves pushed back toward the flames by the very wind that should have saved them. For the bombers, the mission was almost over. One by one, they turned away from Tokyo, engines strained, wings buffeted by the rising heat. Some aircraft barely made it out of the turbulence. Others carried shrapnel damage from flak bursts. 14 would not return at all. But the operation itself had worked with chilling precision. Curtis LeMay's gamble, to strip the bombers, drop low, and flood the city with fire, had worked exactly as intended. Tokyo had been set alight. And on the ground, for hundreds of thousands of civilians, the real battle was only beginning. The inferno that engulfed Tokyo in the early hours of March 10, 1945, moved faster than people could run. What had begun as thousands of pinpoint fires was now a single living force, raging, expanding, consuming everything in its path. In the Shitamachi district, the air grew unbreathable within minutes. Oxygen vanished, replaced by smoke and burning gas. The heat struck not like a wave, but like a solid wall. Wooden homes that had stood for generations collapsed in seconds. Roofs crumpled, tatami mats curled and blackened, and narrow alleys became tunnels of fire. Yoshiko Hashimoto, a 24-year-old mother, would later testify that the sound of the bomblets hitting the ground was like a downpour on a tin roof. At first, she thought it was another raid like the ones before, loud, frightening, but survivable. Within minutes, she realized this was different. The wind was howling. The temperature soared. Flames seemed to race toward her family from every direction at once. She ran with her baby in her arms, her parents and siblings close behind. But the streets, those familiar paths she had walked her entire life, were unrecognizable. Fire was everywhere. The Sumida River glittered ahead, a promise of safety, but reaching it meant pushing through walls of people, choking smoke and falling debris. Others weren't so lucky. Families were torn apart in the crush. Elderly residents, unable to move quickly, fell and disappeared into the sea of flames. Wooden signboards and roof tiles flew through the air as the wind fed the firestorm. Buckets and hand pumps, the city's meager firefighting tools, were abandoned almost immediately. Even trained fire brigades had no choice but to run. The firestorm behaved with the precision of a machine. It fed on the city's wooden frame and the strong night wind, creating tornado-like vortices that sucked in air from surrounding districts. Those who managed to reach open spaces found the wind shoving them back toward the fire. For some, the only choice was the water. At the river's edge, Yoshiko's father shoved her and the baby into the dark water as burning debris rained from the sky. Roof beams, door frames, and embers swirled overhead. The river should have been refuge, but the heat was so intense that even the surface of the water grew scalding. All around, people jumped in, clinging to anything that would float. Many never resurfaced. On both banks, warehouses and temples burned together, flames reflected in the black water like a mirror of hell. Back in the burning streets, air temperature surpassed 1800 degrees F. Concrete cracked, metal warped, and glass ran like molten wax. Those who stayed inside their homes were trapped as flames leapt from wall to wall. Many shelters, built hastily from wood and corrugated tin, simply turned into ovens. Entire families were found later, huddled together, their outlines burned into the ground. Evacuation centers, schools, temples, police stations offered no sanctuary. At Kikukawa Elementary School, hundreds crowded into the courtyard. When the flames reached them, there was nowhere to go. Days later, investigators found little more than charred remains and twisted iron. The firefighters of Tokyo, exhausted and under-equipped, fought where they could, but with only 286 fire engines, most manually operated, the system collapsed within the first hour. Water mains ruptured under the heat. Pumps seized, buckets ran dry, entire companies vanished in the flames. The firestorm didn't just burn buildings, it rewrote the city's physics. Winds grew so strong they picked people up and hurled them down the street. Doors ripped off their hinges became airborne projectiles. The roar of the fire was louder than bombs, drowning out screams and sirens alike. Many survivors described the sky itself as red, a living ceiling of fire. Smoke rose so thick it reached the bombers overhead, still circling and turning home. The crews saw it too. From the air, Tokyo wasn't a map anymore. It was a single, unbroken blaze, larger than anything most had ever imagined. By 3 a.m., entire neighborhoods had disappeared. Shitamachi, Honjo, Fukugawa, places with centuries of history, were nothing more than ash and twisted iron. More than 1 million residents lived in those districts. Most had nowhere to run. Even outside the target zone, the heat traveled. Wooden bridges caught fire. Train lines melted. The city's water system collapsed. Fire brigades from other wards tried to respond, but narrow streets and flaming debris blocked every route. For hours, the city burned unchecked. Survivors later described a strange silence that followed the initial panic, a stunned, collective awareness that the city was being erased around them. Those who had escaped to rivers, canals, or open ground huddled together, watching their homes vanish. The wind carried embers miles away, lighting new fires that joined the storm. At dawn, when the flames finally began to subside, the scale of destruction became clear. 15 square miles of Tokyo lay in ruins. More than a quarter of the city's structures were gone. Entire communities had been erased overnight. The death toll defied comprehension. Estimates varied. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey recorded nearly 88,000 dead. Tokyo's Metropolitan Police counted over 83,000, while the fire department claimed close to 100,000 fatalities. Historians now agree the true number was well over 100,000 lives lost in a single night, more than either atomic bombing that would follow months later. Another 125,000 were injured, many burned beyond recognition. More than 1 million people were left homeless. For Yoshiko, the night was a blur of water, fire, and loss. She survived, clutching her baby in the river, but her parents and sister did not. She would later testify, "When I looked back at the city, it wasn't Tokyo anymore. It was just fire." The raid was not a surgical strike. It was a deliberate act of overwhelming destruction, designed to collapse not only Tokyo's industry, but its will to resist. Factories hidden inside residential neighborhoods were gone, so were the neighborhoods themselves. In Guam, when reports reached LeMay's command center, there were no cheers, no celebration, just confirmation. The mission had achieved its objective. One of his aides quietly observed, "Tokyo isn't a city tonight, it's an ash heap." For those on the ground, however, the cost could not be measured in tonnage or targets destroyed. It was measured in families who never saw each other again, in children lost in the crush, in rivers that boiled with heat and panic. The city of wood, built over centuries, had been turned into a city of ash in less than 6 hours. When the fires of Tokyo finally dimmed, the dawn that followed revealed a city erased. Where neighborhoods once pulsed with life, there were only ashes, charred frames, and the blackened outlines of foundations. Smoke drifted across the ruins for days. Survivors wandered in silence, searching for loved ones they would never find. It was the morning of March 10, 1945, and the heart of Japan's capital had ceased to exist. From the sky, reconnaissance photographs showed a vast gray void where a metropolis had been. To military analysts, those images meant success. To the people who lived there, they marked the end of a world. General Curtis LeMay studied those photos at his command post on Guam. The data was undeniable. 15 square miles destroyed, over 100,000 killed, and thousands more injured or displaced. Tokyo's industrial capacity, once interwoven with its residential districts, was shattered. But LeMay's expression was cold, unreadable. When asked later if he had any regret, he replied simply, "If we lose, we'll be tried as war criminals." He knew the moral cost, but he also believed the raid had shortened the war. The logic was relentless. Japan's resistance remained fierce, its army undefeated in spirit. Every week of war meant more Allied deaths on land, at sea, and in the air. The Tokyo firebombing and the campaigns that followed against Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and more were designed to break that resistance through sheer shock and attrition. Between March and August 1945, more than 60 Japanese cities were targeted in similar incendiary raids. Each one became a rehearsal for apocalypse. By summer, strategic planners began calculating the potential cost of a ground invasion, Operation Downfall. Estimates predicted up to 1 million Allied casualties and several million Japanese dead. In that light, some argued, the destruction of Tokyo was grim arithmetic, a step toward avoiding something even worse. Yet even among those who accepted the logic, a question lingered. At what point does necessity become indistinguishable from cruelty? In Tokyo, survivors face that question every day. Thousands wandered the ruins barefoot, searching for water and shelter. Makeshift cremation sites dotted the open fields. The smell of burnt wood and flesh hung in the air for weeks. Hospitals overflowed. Children, now orphans, clung to soldiers and strangers alike, unable to comprehend what had happened. Amid the devastation, the Japanese government maintained its official resolve. Radio broadcasts continued. Newspapers called for unity and endurance. But morale was collapsing. The Night of Fire had revealed something the authorities could no longer deny. The empire could no longer protect its own capital. American intelligence reports noted the psychological impact immediately. Civilian confidence in victory, one memo read, has been destroyed. Industrial output fell sharply as workers dispersed or died. The city that once symbolized Japan's strength had become a monument to its vulnerability. Meanwhile, on the American side, debate stirred quietly among strategists and diplomats. Was the firebombing a legitimate act of war? The Hague Conventions of 1907 prohibited attacks on undefended cities, but Tokyo, as a seat of industry and military administration, was classified as defended. The line between military necessity and civilian massacre blurred completely in the smoke. Historians would argue about that line for decades. Supporters of LeMay's campaign pointed to context, Japan's refusal to surrender, its militarized economy, and the brutality of its own conduct across Asia. They saw the firebombing as a means to end the war more quickly, saving lives in the aggregate. Critics, however, saw it differently. To them, the night of March 9–10 was not a battle, but a mass execution by fire, the deliberate annihilation of a city filled mostly with women, children, and the elderly. The lack of distinction between combatant and civilian, they argued, marked a profound break in the ethics of modern warfare. The debate only deepened after August 1945, when atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In retrospect, Operation Meeting House, the Tokyo raid's official name, was seen by many as the first step into a new era of total destruction, where technology and strategy fused into a single, unstoppable force. When Japan surrendered on August 15, the ruins of Tokyo were still smoldering in parts. The emperor's voice, broadcast over a broken nation, called for an end to suffering. In those final words, the promise of peace carried the echo of fire. After the war, Japan rebuilt with astonishing speed. Within a decade, Tokyo had transformed from ruins to a modern capital, but the scars remained, invisible yet enduring. Survivors carried memories that could not be rebuilt, the sound of bombs falling like rain, the color of the sky, the silence of the dead. Every March, memorials rise from the ashes in the Sumida and Katabuki districts, where the firestorm was fiercest. Bells toll. Flowers are laid on stone monuments etched with names that represent only a fraction of those lost. At the Tokyo Memorial Hall, photographs of burned streets and anonymous bodies line the walls. Many visitors still describe an unbearable quiet there, a silence that speaks louder than any siren. For the United States, the bombing of Tokyo became a military case study. Analysts dissected it for efficiency, accuracy, and psychological effect. It shaped doctrines for decades, proof that air power alone could cripple a nation. But for others, it stood as a warning that victory achieved by annihilation carries a cost beyond the battlefield. LeMay himself never wavered. In his later years, he admitted no regret. He argued that his duty was not to question morality, but to win wars as efficiently as possible. He once told an interviewer, "War is cruel. The sooner it's over, the better for everyone." And yet, for those who lived through that night, the cruelty was not abstract. It was the air they breathed, the light they ran from, the ashes they woke to. Tokyo's reconstruction would become a symbol of human resilience, but the fire that destroyed it remains a shadow behind every gleaming tower that now rises from its ashes. The historian John Dower once wrote, "In Tokyo, modern warfare achieved its purest form, destruction detached from combat. It was a war fought not between armies, but between a machine of industrial fire and a city made of wood and flesh." 80 years later, the lessons of that night still burn quietly in the collective memory of nations. The raid on Tokyo was not forgotten because it cannot be. It was the night when war revealed its final, most terrible truth. That progress and horror can share the same spark. and that sometimes victory leaves nothing untouched but the sky.